gives me great pleasure to be the person to introduce Dame Nancy Rothwell, our first keynote speaker today. Nancy is a psychologist by background and has served as President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Manchester between 2010 and 2024, and also served as Non-Exec Director of AstraZeneca from 2006 to 2015. And as Deputy Chair of the Industrial Strategy Advisory Group, Nancy is the perfect person to launch our conference programme, where we are so focused on collaboration, impact, economic growth. So Nancy is going to come and talk to us about strengthening university and business collaboration to drive growth and prosperity. So without further ado, Dame Nancy, take the stage. Thank you.
So thank you, Amanda. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm only sorry I'm not here for the whole conference. It sounds absolutely fascinating. I suspect that my role, just alluded to as Deputy Chair of the Industrial Strategy Advisory Council, might be the reason that I was invited. The Industrial Strategy White Paper is due to be published this month. We don't have a date yet. It will be after the Comprehensive Spending Review. I can't tell you the detail of what's in it. That's not just because of confidentiality, but because it's just completing what's called the government write round, when white papers go to every government department for comment. So it might come back looking very different to the last time I saw it. But I certainly can tell you about the parts of it that we've been deeply involved in, much of which relates to innovation, universities, knowledge exchange. I do want to, at this point, say a huge thank you to Rosalind Gill from the National Centre for Universities and Business and her colleagues, because they did all the hard work on my presentation. I'm going to leave time for questions. If they're too difficult, I'll hand them over to Rosalind. But I'm very happy to take questions. So in terms of overview of my presentation, I'm going to dwell a little bit on troubled times, which seems to be a feature of our current world, talking about the challenges and some opportunities, of course, as well. I'll talk about a chapter of change, which describes the role of the forthcoming industrial strategy and its approach, and then looking forward. So we all know we are in troubled times, times of change. And believe me, within government, I've never seen so much change ongoing. I'll come on in a moment to the reports that I know that are coming out in the next few weeks, which are many. And I'll talk in a moment about specific troubled times of the higher education sector. But just on a wider basis, we know there are financial challenges. We know about global politics, which seems to be changing on a daily basis. I see tariffs are back at 50% again. That may change tomorrow. And then both challenges and opportunity of automation, artificial intelligence and technology, and of course the pressing need for meeting net zero. All of these are challenges, but they also represent opportunities. So Stuart's already alluded to the 5 UK government missions, and we should remember we have a government that has been in power for less than a year, but they are certainly not standing back and waiting. Of these, secure the highest sustained growth in the G7, I'll come back to, because it is the major one. We will in the summer see the 10-year plan for the National Health Service. I understand it's likely to be a radical plan, but delivering it will be obviously a challenge. Making Britain's streets safe, breaking down the barriers to opportunity, there is a real concern, I think, across our society about growing inequalities, both regional and socio-economic. And of course, making Britain a clean energy power. But, as Stuart said, the key driver is economic growth. So the challenge for the Industrial Strategy Council Advisory Board was growth, productivity and prosperity. How do we drive that? How do we remove the barriers that are stopping all of those from happening? And I'll come on to in a moment how we assessed those barriers. Defence has come in rather late and is something we haven't particularly addressed, but is something that we will be doing so in the future, with an uplift, would you believe, 2.5%, 3% of GDP. It seems to change on a daily basis, but there is an opportunity here, obviously, around research. Then, of course, immigration is a big issue. It's a big issue for the higher education sector, it's a big issue for knowledge, and it's a big issue for industry. It's been a topic we've discussed quite extensively because, as I'll come on to in a moment, one of the major difficulties for knowledge exchange and growth is skills. And we either train our own, which we need to do at great cost, or we bring in immigrants. And there is, of course, a government priority to reduce net migration. So you may have seen the Immigration White Paper. We've worked quite closely with the Migration Advisory Committee, chaired by Brown Bell. Some parts of that were very welcome. The talent visas, obviously welcome. The costs, much less welcome. But what was something of a surprise was the appendix, including a potential 6% levy on international student fees. Everybody's a bit confused by that because it was stated that it was to subsidise skills. But any of you who work in the university sector know that that is exactly what international student fees do. They subsidise British students. So it seems a little unusual. And it would be a very significant cost to universities at a particularly difficult time. If I can give you one example, a calculation for University College London is over £41 million a year. That, even for a large and wealthy university like UCL, is a significant factor. Then, of course, another uncertainty is young people from the European Union who may be allowed to come and study here. What we don't know is what would the fee be for them to come to study. And again, we've looked at the impacts of that because universities are probably going to be reluctant to take European students at the UK fee level because most lose money on it. But indeed, if they are open to coming here, we may not be able to refuse them, with significant implications, perhaps, for places for British students. But that's an unknown at the moment. So the UK economy, and two graphs I'm going to show you. The first one here shows growth forecast up to 2024. After that, it is a projection, of course, from NCUB based on ONS data, and it's not great, the growth. Even into the future, it's not great. Now, of course, this covers vast regional differences. Overall growth rate has been far greatest in London and the Greater South East. Interestingly, over the last 5 and the last 10 years, one of the highest growth rates, 4.5% a year, has been my own region of Greater Manchester. And one of the things the Council has been looking at is where are there opportunities where we can drive growth further, particularly outside London and the South East, but there is no suggestion that we should remove support and funding from London and the South East. And indeed, you'll have seen the announcements around Heathrow Extension on the Oxford-Cambridge link. So this is very much about unlocking growth, but it's also about productivity, which is low and flatlining, if anything declining. Economic productivity in the UK is significantly lower than many of our counterparts in the G7. Again, it's regional. And this time, areas like Greater Manchester and many outside the South East, it's well below the national average. Now, why is that? All sorts of reasons. Obviously, skills is one of them, innovation, tech adoption, and shift to automation, which has been slow in many areas, and a big one, of course, is health. It's estimated by the government that the cost of poor health in this country is in excess of £250 billion a year, possibly over £300 billion a year. And indeed, a lot of that we know is due to regional differences and inequalities. My colleague in Manchester, who's a health economist, published a paper demonstrating that 30% of the gap in productivity between the north and the south is due to poorer health. So closing that gap would probably have the biggest impact of all on our productivity and on growth. Obviously, we're not immune to changes across the world, and we're facing significant global conflict. And this sparks changes in fiscal and in R&D policy. We've seen a very big increase in the spend on defence, which is likely to include an increase in R&D and an increase in knowledge exchange. There's a particular emphasis on SMEs here. We have some large companies in defence, but also quite a number of growing SMEs. Now, for some universities, maybe for all universities, there is a sensitivity about working in the defence space, but a lot of what they are asking for is generic. It's understanding AI systems, it's general engineering. And this raises the question, I think, which is very much on all of our minds, is in the spending review, or in the months that follow, will we hear more about the emphasis on basic versus applied or innovation research. There will be a tilt towards the industrial strategy sectors, which I'll come on to in a moment, but many of you will have heard our Science Minister, Patrick Vallance, who is absolutely anxious to protect fundamental research, because that is what will lead to the next stage of applied research and innovation. That obviously will emerge over coming months, and a number of reviews will address this. But an interesting figure where the UK is doing quite well is on tech adoption. This is the share of patents related to artificial intelligence, which have tripled in the last 5 years. Now, many of us feel threatened by AI, and there certainly are threats, but there are also some huge opportunities to be realised. In our operations of our organisations, whether universities, business or other organisations, in research, in speeding things up, in reskilling and in teaching. I saw fascinating reports from the universities of Stanford and Harvard in the use of AI in teaching. They took 3 groups of students. One group was taught one-to-one by a personal tutor. Another group was taught in a large class of 200. And the third group had a one-to-one AI bot teaching it. The best was the one-to-one personal tutor, but the one-to-one AI bot far exceeded the large class in many, many ways. And the conclusion was, we won't be doing away with teachers, we will be using AI to facilitate the teaching, and then the teachers will come in and do the analysis and do the critique. But of course, AI also has its drawbacks. It is very heavy on energy consumption. And there are 2 problems with that. One, of course, is net zero, and the other is the cost of energy, which is featured very strongly in the discussions at the Industrial Strategy Advisory Council. I was told that the cost of electricity in the UK is 5 times that of the cost in Texas. And we wonder why it might sometimes be difficult to attract companies. Obviously, there are some opportunities around, with many changes coming. And AI is just one of them. We have a complex funding scheme in the UK, largely from DCIT, but also from many other departments, particularly the Department of Health and Social Care, NIH funding, then many charities, then of course government companies and international, including EU. I think we'll be seeing some significant changes at UKRI under the new leadership that will be starting later in the summer, and new leadership at Innovate UK. And this has certainly been something that we've been discussing in great detail about how they can be shaped to better deliver growth and prosperity while also still supporting fundamental research and knowledge exchange. So we are in a time of change, no doubt, perhaps a time for change in research and innovation. And that means we're going to have to be adaptable and flexible. We still, as I said, have a relatively new government. We have universities not in the best of places at the current time. And the Industrial Strategy Council is very aware of both the internal and the external factors. So much developing is a plan for the future. Obviously, the Industrial Strategy White Paper, which I alluded to, will be one of them. It will be coming out later this month, and I will talk a little bit about that in a moment. There is an ongoing review of higher education. There will be a skills white paper, an infrastructure white paper, a trade strategy report. We've already had reports on SMEs, artificial intelligence, sector plans, intellectual property, and many more. The key is joining these up, and that has been a challenge, because how do you ensure that each of these is complementary and that it delivers? So let me come on now to the industrial strategy. The government published a green paper laying out its plans for industrial strategy some time ago. And just to remind you, the 8 sectors: life sciences, advanced manufacturing, creative industries, clean energy, digital and tech, financial services, professional business, and defence, with the latter perhaps a little less well developed. The Industrial Strategy Council has reviewed all of the sector plans. I have to say I'm particularly pleased that creative is in there. As a scientist, I've always worried a bit that many of our future plans and our strategies have focused very much on the big shiny science and engineering and has not taken account of the real importance of humanities and the creative industries, which, depending on whose figure you take, is worth in excess of £100 billion a year. I spoke to a group of members of the CBI a few weeks ago on the industrial strategy and how it was developing, and I promised to go back once it's published. I was preceded by somebody from the Tony Blair Institute, and they've also done a report on industrial strategy, which is actually quite good. And he said two things which I could not have agreed with more. The first is industrial strategy is important. You do need a plan. I was on the earlier Industrial Strategy Council formed by Greg Clark, who incidentally is on the current one again, even though from the opposition party. And that was terminated and the industrial strategy was dropped. But he reported that pretty much every successful country in the world has an industrial strategy. But then the next thing he said was, but it's really, really difficult. It's difficult for lots of reasons. There have to be trade-offs. You find you suggest something over here and it affects something over there. Something over here and it's detrimental over there. And it costs money. And that is something that is not in great supply. And then there are the time scales. Everybody's in a hurry. Many of the changes that are suggested as part of an industrial strategy will take years to deliver. And this is why we will have an ongoing role. But everybody wants to get there more quickly. So the Industrial Strategy Council was formed just before Christmas. We got the devastating news then that we would be preparing the white paper by May. Then it became late spring. June's late spring, by the way. And I think September's summer, but it will be out in June. So chaired by Claire Barclay, who you can just see in the middle, I think, next to Johnny Reynolds, Secretary of State for Business and Trade. We report to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, and Johnny Reynolds. It's a fascinating council. I urge you to go and look at the members. Very, very varied. Many from industry, some from startups, some from politics, three of us from the university sector. And one of the first things that the Industrial Strategy Unit had done was a survey of thousands of businesses. And interestingly, the National Centre for Universities and Businesses, which I've been working with, I'll come back to in a moment, have also done surveys in a different context. And they asked all of those, what are the things holding you back? Then we also asked each of the sectors, the 8 industrial strategy sectors, what is holding you back? It was interesting. There was complete agreement. Large, small, sectors, industry, what's holding them back are costs of energy, skills, access to finance, regulation and bureaucracy, innovation, place, and inward investment. And so as a result of that, we formed subgroups of the Industrial Strategy Council to look at each of those areas. We won't be reporting on all of them in the white paper. Some are ongoing, some are easier than others. The ones I've been particularly involved in are place and skills, but also innovation. As a result of that, I can't tell you how many meetings we've had. I think Amanda asked me how often does it meet. As well, 4, 5, sometimes 6 times a week over the last 3 months it has been. Both in person, but then with ministers regularly, with the Department for Education, Migration Advisory Council, the mayors of the strategic authorities, the trade unions, the CBI, many others. So in theory, I'd assume that our work would stop when the white paper was published, other than an ongoing role in monitoring and evaluation. That is not to be the case, because first of all, there are some things that will just take a lot longer. Skills will be one, and we work closely with Skills England. Other things will be changing as we go along. And I'm heartened to hear from government that we know some things that we recommend might not quite work, or something external comes along and happens and means we have to adjust or tilt. And so we will be ongoing, hopefully not 5 or 6 times a week. So innovation is a golden thread in the industrial strategy because of its impact on productivity and growth. Obviously, universities feature strongly in this, both in terms of their fundamental research, their skills, their training, their spin-outs, their relationship with business, which I'll spend a few moments on in a minute, and, of course, their work globally. We should not forget the global influence of universities. through their partnerships, through also their alumni, which are an incredible soft power. But universities, like everybody else, are facing major changes. I love this slide because this person is called Lena Gade, and she's one of our graduates, and she's the chief race engineer for Audi 24-hour Le Mans. And I just love showing it to schoolgirls. You could do that too. So the key drivers for change, we all know the political ones, UK and beyond, economic pressures, and it's really hard recommending an industrial strategy when you know there isn't very much money available. It means you've got to look really hard at policy drivers. Inequalities is a big one. Technological advances. We hear from everyone we consult with that bureaucracy and regulation is a big hindrance, and I'm sure many of you working will be familiar with that. And then, of course, environmental. And I don't need to tell you that universities play a huge role in this. I won't go through all of these, but in addition to our main role in skills, research, innovation, we obviously partner with business. We also work closely with local communities. Many universities collaborate. You may well have seen the report from the UK that came out yesterday, chaired by Nigel Carrington, on the financial challenges of universities. One of the key recommendations was more collaboration. I was asked to advise the Department for Education on university finances, which I was a bit reluctant to do, to be perfectly honest, and the answer seemed to be mergers. And I said, look, I've gone through one of the biggest mergers in university history. It was fantastic, the outcome was hugely positive when the two universities in Manchester merged, but it cost a lot of money and it took a lot of time. And it was more than 5 years later before they were truly aligned. The Carrington report recommends more of federations, partnerships, shared facilities, and also recommends that the potential limitation of VAT charges on shared services should be removed. It also commented that something has to be done about flexibility on pensions for those universities whose staff run the teachers' pension scheme. So there is no doubt, and it is well recognised by universities, by government, that universities play a critical role. The next slide was produced by Universities UK, and I use it whenever I can. It was an independent commission that looked at the cost of universities and the total return to the UK. I don't need to tell you it's vast. 18.6 billion cost, 265 billion estimated total return to the UK. That's £14 back for every pound. It's public, this slide, so I'm not giving away any secrets. Then it breaks down where that comes from. Obviously, international is a big one, but that is a concern as international student numbers are going down. When I saw this number, I thought, really? Is that definitely the case? But then I got the data for my own university. Again, an independent analysis by Oxford Economics. So the turnover of the University of Manchester last year was 1.3 billion. I love to tell you that that's bigger than either of the two football clubs or Manchester Airport Group. Perhaps not as popular, but never mind. But the independent analysis suggests that the estimated contribution to the economy is 7.3 billion. That's large, and when you count all the universities, then it's quite easy to get to the 265. And I think we've got better at doing this. I'll show you an older figure in a minute that I think was an underestimate. And then, I don't know that these numbers fully capture the contribution of students to our community. In universities with large numbers of international students, you'll be very well aware of that contribution. I was when I spoke to a Chinese student and I asked where she lived. She lived in a very fancy apartment block in central Manchester. I said, oh, do you rent that? And she said, no, my dad bought it for me. In fact, he bought 3. One for me, one for my belongings, and one for my parents when they come to visit. And she loves Harvey Nichols. So, obviously, there is a huge... And the taxi drivers in any major city will tell you how bad it is when the students go home. But, of course, universities are incredibly complex, and it seems becoming ever more complex, as we're expected to do more with less. We are expected now to do what some might argue should be the domain of the National Health Service, which is supporting student health. Of course, we all do, but how much can we do it within our limited resources? And we're also very complicated because of the number of stakeholders that we have. So I won't go through all of these, but most organisations have their staff, their supply chain and their customers. Of course, we have loads of all of those. Increasingly parents, I have to say, in addition to students. but regulators, governments, for health, NHS, of course, business, and each of them expects something different. But UK research and higher education is a major asset, and universities are at the heart of this. Translating that into growth is a challenge, and something all of you are trying to do all of the time. And getting that balance right between blue skies research and how can we apply it? Because without the blue skies research, we won't have anything to apply. And increasingly, as I'll show you in a moment, industry is disinvesting from fundamental research. We've seen that from big labs in the USA. One of the things I'm particularly interested to see how it's doing, and it seems to be doing well, is ARIA, which is meant to be really risky research, new, different, had a difficult task, but it seems to be doing well. And one of the things we're all facing is risk versus certainty. How much do we bet on something that's risky that might have a high payoff? And I like the quote of my colleague, Andre Guy, if you follow the trodden path, you might find that all the grass has been eaten. So Andre has done amazing research, some of it very, very risky. He used to find it a little bit difficult to get funding sometimes, but that somehow changed when he got the Nobel Prize, which made it all worthwhile, by the way. So universities, industry, invention and innovation, of course there are many. Notes is a very old figure for contribution of 95 billion. That's 10 years old, and I think it's an underestimate. But obviously in intellectual property, in spin-out companies, in partnership with business, we had a very good review chaired by Irene Tracy last year, which dealt with intellectual property. But of course, our skills is a very big part of what we do. And many universities now have courses on entrepreneurship, also provide services for industry and perhaps increasingly do so, and manage intellectual property. I used to believe that employment was very much about the subject that students were studying, but then came to realise that with a few exceptions, if you're going to be a doctor, you probably need to have trained in medicine, same for nursing, but for the vast majority of employment, that is not the case. It's about meeting the needs of business. And when we survey every year our top 100 employers and ask them what do they want in a graduate, they don't mind if it's English or maths or engineering or history of art. What they want is problem solving, critical thinking, communication skills, teamworking and collaboration, and an ability to acquire new skills. They should be the things that we should focus on for the future. But of course, we are facing significant challenges at the moment. We are seeing the university sector with a big deficit at the present time, and we're also seeing a decline in business R&D investment. That's been a 6% decline over the period, the last few years. And also, we've seen a 20% reduction in the spending on skills. So, the National Centre for Universities and Business, and indeed the Industrial Strategy Council, have been asking, why is that? Why are businesses investing less? The obvious one is financial pressures. But it's more complicated than that, particularly in skills, because businesses often feel they're taxed. They have the apprenticeship levy, and so why would they spend it twice? They know that further education colleges are under huge pressure and often not able to deliver those skills. They also, I'm sorry to say, point at the higher education sector, who they said used to be unaware of the true costs of training for industry and now woken up to it and are charging those true costs. So these are challenges for both business and the university sector. There are also challenges to the public research and innovation system. I think with pressure, we don't know what's going to be in the spending review. I'm told it's going to be tight. Everybody's obviously hoping that it will be as close to real terms flat cash as possible. We'll find out next week. Innovation, but also challenges in research and innovation. I've touched a little on fundamental knowledge versus application. How much are individuals? Because we still reward individuals for their research and often for their innovation. Research culture and integrity, collaboration versus competition. I could go on with many different challenges. And increasing role of defence. Of course, we cannot be immune to the situation across the Atlantic, which is dreadful, but does pose some opportunities. And funds have already been set up, and more will be set up. The Royal Society, the Royal Academy of Engineering have both announced their Global Talent Funds. I believe the government will do so shortly. But of course, the university sector is facing very significant financial challenges. I always used to say, you can explain university finances in one sentence. This was a number of years ago. We break even on UK students, we lose money on research, and we make a bit of money on international students. Of course, it's very different now. We lose money on our home students, particularly on high-cost subjects, and you've probably seen the reports in the press just in the last few days that the number of places for high-cost subjects are not keeping up with demand, and many of these are the ones that are needed for growth: engineering, computer science, artificial intelligence, and so on. Now, of course, in addition to fees losing money, we lose even more money on research, and I know the government is keen to try to address that. And we have seen a decline in international students, partly because of the visa change, well, largely because of the visa changes under the previous government. There are reports of 10,000 redundancies in the sector, likely 40% in deficit. And I mentioned the Carrington Review, which reported that 19% of universities have already reduced their spend on research, and 79% may do so in the future. 89% would consider course closures. So obviously this is a significant problem. Universities UK is going on to look at delivery of potential changes, and as I mentioned, there is a government review of the higher education sector. Just to put it into context, the research deficit is currently running just short of £5.5 billion. So universities are putting £5.5 billion into research. There is a concern, obviously, because of student fees. Not at all popular to increase fees, obviously, for students, their parents, families, even for universities. But if that decline continues, then we will be seriously subsidising. There is also a worry about whether international students will continue to come. There is, of course, notably a decline in international students travelling to the USA and an increase in applicants from the US. So that may be something that can help us in the future. But at the present time, and with high inflation, the freezing of resource is a real problem. One of the calls has been to at least year-on-year increase fees with inflation. But it may be that we need more radical thoughts about how we finance students. Our fees are already higher than most of our competitor countries, and our government spend is lower. But this is probably a difficult time to be urging a big increase in spending. And also we know that further education colleges, which many of us partner with, are facing great difficulties. So finally, looking forward, we are undoubtedly a national asset, critical in the coming decade, critical in the industrial strategy, critical in delivering growth. But it's all very well having strategies, white papers and plans. The issue is in the delivery. How do we deliver this? The critical gap is a business environment that supports and incentivises research and development. That will be key to the future. Without doubt, we do need a clear plan, which is the industrial strategy, which will be ongoing. We are stressing very much the day of publication is a moment in time. That will not be the end of it. It will be continuing. Ultimately, though, solving UK's problems will be driven by industries and other critical actors, such as universities. So as I mentioned, on the Industrial Strategy Council, I belong to two groups. We've had extensive discussions about universities and their contribution, and I hope they will feature strongly in the final white paper. But I've also been working with the National Centre for Universities and Business on a task force, together with Sir John Manzoni and Sir John Simons, to look at how we can make recommendations that will drive more business R&D and skills spending. This is looking at, has talked to many businesses, and like the Industrial Strategy Unit, has looked at what's holding you back, and will be making a number of recommendations when its report finally comes out. I'm just going to highlight the key recommendations that we will be publishing, and these are basically in four. Align, simplify, reform and deliver. Obviously, we need to align with the UK research and development and with national priorities, industrial strategy, and with what our businesses want. We'll argue for a simplification of the research and development system by consolidating resources. I mentioned the huge complexity of our funding. Even within a single department, it's complex. Any of you who've worked with multiple research councils will know they're all slightly different. And I was a little upset to find that having gone through long processes to be approved to be on MRC Council, that didn't work for something else I had to do within the same organisation. So I think simplification is going to be needed. Likely reform to UKRI, certainly on the cards, as we see a new chief executive coming in. Strengthening connection between world-class research and business R&D, and of course delivery, which is always the difficult one. So, universities alongside government will play a critical role in knowledge exchange. I think we will need to align to the national priorities, at least for part of what we do, certainly for some of our research and certainly for innovation and for knowledge exchange. I think that we will find ourselves in a changing financial landscape and possibly limited government solutions based on finances. But one of the things we must remember is to be rigorously defensive of our core mission. You will have seen some of the challenges to the core mission of universities in the United States. Thankfully, that is not happening here, and nor should it. We should remember what we are about and what we are for. Knowledge exchange is an important part of it, but also we are important, independent organisations, protectors of free speech, but also keen to collaborate and to contribute to the UK's growth and prosperity. And obviously, your role in this will be critical. I'm going to say thank you very much indeed, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. That was sobering in many ways, but also kind of encouraging, and the complexity of what you've got to deal with bringing together those various strategies, and as you say, that kind of the compromise that's needed and the kind of complex consequences. Absolutely fascinating. So we have roving mics around the room, so if you would like to ask a question, then please raise your hand. The mic will come to you, and if you can say your name and your organisation, that would be great. So, let's rely on the people with the mics looking for hands as well. Any questions to piss off? While you're all thinking, I've got one. I mean, you said that the Advisory Council is a very broad and diverse mix of people. What's been the main challenge of getting kind of, consensus amongst those members, or has it actually been quite clear that your views are similar?
Yeah, it's generally been pretty good actually. We've reached consensus fairly quickly. Obviously for some, their day job makes it difficult for them. And therefore most of what we have put to the Prime Minister so far and proposed letters are that this is not unanimous, but consensus.
Yeah.
But generally, it's been a fascinating group, lots of challenge, lots of opinionated people, not afraid at all to make those opinions known, but very, very clever people.
Brilliant, thank you. I can see the mic's moved. There's a couple of questions. Richard, and sorry, I don't know your name.
Hi, it's Richard Baker from Durham University. Fascinating presentation, thank you very much. I was just thinking about your list of issues around the challenges around strengthening innovation and productivity. And I just wondered the extent to which the Council discussed the structure of our business base in the UK. We've spent a lot of time being very successful in securing foreign direct investment, but I wonder whether we've got the balance quite right in terms of growing the indigenous investment, where we have HQ functions R&D centres? That seems to me to be a bit of a gap in our analysis.
Yeah. We have discussed it, and both in tilting towards what sort of companies we need in the future, how they get support, and where they're based. And I mentioned that I'm part of the Place Group, and obviously one of the things that we've talked about a lot is clusters, and also a range. But the UK R&D spend has tended to depend on a small number of very large multinationals, particularly in health and engineering, which is good and great, and they do contribute hugely to research and development and skills. But we're not bad at the small startups, we're not very good at the medium, actually, and much of that is the gap in follow-on funding. Aside from the shortage of follow-on funding, it's geographically quite constrained. Most of it is in the southeast, and it's quite hard. There are moves to improve that and to get more funding, and you've probably seen the release of pension funds as one option to do that. We've been talking to the British Business Bank, and they will be working with Innovate UK, because I think that will be a key factor. But AI companies are growing very fast, actually. And it may be, again, more favourable environment here than some other countries around the world at the moment. And the scheme to attract global talent isn't just about academic researchers, it's about entrepreneurs as well.
Another gentleman on the same row.
I think next.
Thanks very much. I'm Kieran O'Shea, University of Hertfordshire. Your last slide, it's on one before, you mentioned that universities need to align the industrial strategy, completely agree with, but I wondered, do you think that could result in cuts in areas where perhaps subjects aren't necessarily obviously aligned?
I hope not. As I mentioned, the Science Minister, Patrick Allens, has stressed the importance of protecting fundamental research. But I think a challenge for universities, and particularly some that are not huge, will be, what are we going to be really good at? We can't be really good at everything. So what's going to be our thing? What's going to be the thing that you say, this is what we... So at the University of Manchester, 10 years ago now, I said, okay, we've got to decide the 5 things we're really good at. It was absolute uproar. And we had a list of 40. So we put it out to consultation, and the list came back at 85. So we eventually did get it down to 5 research beacons. And the point was, that's the window dressing. So if somebody comes in and says, okay, 2-dimensional materials, graphene, that's a no-brainer. But actually there's a lot more on materials and engineering that once you delve into. Cancer is another one, but again, a lot more in health. And I think it's going to be really important to say, what is it that we're really good at? We might do other things as well. And how does that align? Or how, at least as part of it, align? Fundamental research is always under threat because of tight budgets, but I really hope it will not be reduced. I think the plan is that's protected, but then there's growth in innovation areas.
There's a question at the back, and then Adam in the middle over there.
Great.
Hi.
Hi, so I'm Tony Mogenfuso with UIDP. I had a question about the fundamental mission of universities, and then you talked about the alignment. Companies spend a very modest amount of their funding externally, not just at universities, but national labs, contract research organizations. And if you want to get more spend from, especially the multinationals at unis, they're going to have to be willing to do things that companies seek. And so that's disruptive because it would involve a change. And I guess the question is, are there going to be fundamental discussions, do you think, within the UK at the university level to discuss their willingness to do higher TRL work to support companies who will spend more if you help them achieve their business goals? Thank you.
Yeah, really good question, and I completely agree with you. And I think it needs a different model. So I just used the example of graphene, I'll stick with that. We have something called the Graphene Engineering Innovation Centre, which is taking discoveries to higher TRLs. And we realise that although there are academics that work in there, what companies actually want are very highly skilled experimental officers. People whose career depends not necessarily on publishing or return to ref, but actually on delivering a project that might take 6 months or a year that doesn't align. And increasingly, I think universities are seeing variously termed things like professors of practice, people who are more practical but can still hold a chair in a university. It's not going to be for all parts of the university, but I think it's going to be for increasing amounts for some of it to meet the needs of industry. And the other thing that I'm continually told is by industry, universities are risk averse, trying to get a contract agreed takes too long, it's too complicated, the IP discussion is too complicated, and there I think there is an onus on universities to do better at that. But one way of doing it is if there's a large company, for example, rather than negotiating every project, having a strategic oversight agreement, such that once you have that in place, you can do lots and lots of other things without having to go back to the drawing board again. And we know that TTO offices and business contract offices are always overstretched. Adam.
Morning, thanks for a great presentation. So you noted that two key barriers from the feedback from business around productivity were innovation and the regulatory landscape, and there's clearly a tension and a trade-off, probably most acute around AI. We've seen very different approaches to regulation in North America versus Europe, for instance, around AI. Can you give some insight into the Council's thinking about how you reconcile this tension, these two opposing forces?
Yeah, actually this is one that we've had a lot of debates about and probably haven't fully resolved as yet. And I think it is difficult. Protection versus openness is a big deal. And of course, it's a particularly big deal for creative industries at the moment, but also for AI. So I think that debate is still ongoing. And probably will be for some time to come.
There's a question here in front.
So, hi, Zach Russell from the University of Sheffield. I think, other than wanting more money, I think what we could do with time is being able to respond to the strategy and sort of adapt to the opportunity. Do you think we'll be afforded that time, sort of an ever-changing world?
Far be it from me to suggest what the government might do, and that they are in a hurry. I think some of the things will just take time, not least to deliver. Other things should be implementable quite quickly. In terms of finance, some of the regulatory aspects, I think we can do quite quickly. The difficulties at universities are quite slow to turn. It's always said that the older and the more prestigious the university, the longer it takes to change anything. I'm not sure if that's true, but I think there's recognition that some things will take quite a long time, but they will also want to see some results quite quickly.
Question from the back.
Hi there, Matthew Guest at the University of Central Lancashire. So
I thought you were University of Lancashire now.
in the process of doing so, thank you. So it kind of comes into the place question a little bit more, and the sort of conversations that you've been having with mayors, and then also the sort of thinking that you've been having for those places that do not yet have mayors. What's the sort of the balance starting to look like?
So most of our discussions have been with mayors, but recognising that not everywhere has a mayor, and even those that do, there are very, very different stages of maturity. So, Greater Manchester's had a combined authority for over 25 years. Others, they're very, very new. One of the things that we've been looking at is where can we suggest might deliver the biggest growth in productivity. And initially, and I do want to stress initially, that's not going to be that many places. It just can't be, because there's scope to do it. But hopefully then others will follow, and those without mayoral authorities will then be able to join. But we're also very keen to look at removing barriers to collaboration. And obviously geographical co-location helps, but isn't the only thing. University of Manchester's got an innovation partnership with Cambridge because we saw that we both had complementary challenges and strengths. So I would say look to where your best partnership is. And I think, I can't remember, I should know because I live there. Does Lancashire have a mayor?
Not yet.
Okay, but you will have, I'm sure. And it's really difficult where the geography isn't that defined. Greater Manchester's quite easy. Even London is quite easy. Where you have either authorities that cross several regions, or with several cities, then it's much, much more difficult to get a cohesive approach. So I wouldn't underestimate the challenges.
Any other questions? Do you wave?
One over there?
Yes, one in the middle and one over there. So.
Is that
Yes.
is that big? Okay.
That's you,
Well, it
yeah.
kind of follows on from the previous question. I'm Joseph Carroll from the University of Salford. Will the launch of the industrial strategies see a refresh of local industrial strategies? I know Greater Manchester's was launched in 2018. I think that was the first.
Yes, definitely. And in fact, Greater Manchester, I've seen a draft. All of the regions are doing local industrial strategies at the moment. And they will come out, I'm guessing, pretty soon, actually. Because certainly I've seen a fairly advanced copy.
There's a question from a lady in the middle there.
Hello, Rosemary Nunn, University of Southampton. It strikes me, coming from 25 years in industry and about 3 in higher education, that the university sector has done an amazing job at propagating intellectual property nationally and globally. But the management of our intellectual capital and the manner in which that knowledge is exposed to industry and the opportunity for industry to dip in and find out which university is best in its sector, where those top 5 sit across the 195 higher education institutions across the United Kingdom, and to extract that knowledge in a method that the gentleman behind just said was not necessarily tied up in a huge amount of bureaucracy and enabled a fast path to innovation is missing. And is that something that you, or maybe the Industrial Strategy Council, can influence the shape of UKRI to change for the future?
So, absolutely, and that is a suggestion I've made, not particularly through the Industrial Strategy Council, but through other routes. Wouldn't it be great if we could have something that said, right, Southampton, let's take shipping. What are the top 3 or 4 or maybe 5 universities in shipping? 2 things. One, that's a window for industry, and we know that industry finds universities impenetrable. They're really difficult to find out who to get to, and unless they know somebody, and often the collaboration is because they happen to know somebody who used to work there. And secondly, it can be a vehicle for collaboration, because if the Carrington Review stresses collaboration for financial reasons, I would stress it for other reasons. The UK isn't big enough or rich enough to set every university up in competition against each other. There needs to be, in my opinion at least, more funding that is to consortia, which each bring strengths to, and some of the research councils do that, and I think they're looking to do it more. And that would then help, if there was a consortium, again it would help industry. So you could take it from both ends, one sort of audit if you like. There'd be enormous complaints if somebody's not on the list, of course. And then from the other end, if we can get funding for collaboration where universities are complementary and very strong, that would also help with industry.
I think we've got time for one more before the break.
Hi there, I'm Lee McMillan at University of the Arts London, so Nigel Carrington's old uni. Can you say a little bit more about the Council's thinking on the role of creativity and creative innovation in the strategy?
Yeah, we haven't, I don't know that there will be anything specific on it, but we've certainly had a discussion, and you may know the lead for us on creativity is Shruti Videra, who chairs the Royal Shakespeare Company, and also chairs the cultural industries sector. That creativity isn't just restrained to the creative industries. A good engineer, a good biologist, a good historian, they're all creative. And I don't think we've paid enough attention to that, actually. And it was partly behind my quote from Andre Guy, because he just thinks completely out of the box all the time. And I say, how did you come up with that, Andre? He said, no idea, just came to me in a flash. And I think often the biggest breakthroughs in a lot of disciplines are by really creative minds. So, and of course, you know, there is some teaching of creativity. We run courses in creative thinking, but probably not enough.
Thank you. Thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk, but also discussion. You've really stimulated our thoughts and set the scene, I think, for many of the sessions that we'll be hearing from and attending over the next couple of days. So thank you very much. Can we thank Dame Nancy, and then we will...